Hello and welcome once again to the Fair Game podcast. We love you football. I'm Graham Miller, and at the time of recording, we've arrived at a pivotal week for the Football Governance Bill. It's set to complete its committee stage in the House of Lords, with Fair Game arguing that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change football for the better. The belief is football's broken, and only a truly independent regulator, free from any vested interests, can save the national game. So, to bring everyone up to speed and discuss what lies ahead, we've two experts to guide us through the Westminster ways and maze. David Bernstein, a lifelong Manchester City fan who was chairman of the club from 1998 to 2003, is also a former chairman of the Football Association and indeed former chair of Wembley Stadium. And he's joined by Niall Couper, Fair Game's chief executive, and it's fair to say a driving force in the campaign to improve football governance, to provide a solution to the many challenges that faces football today. So Niall, first things first, the clock is ticking down. What can we expect to see over the coming days?
Thank you very much, Graham. So where we're at is that the Football Governance Bill is currently making its way through the House of Lords committee stage, a grand committee stage is what it's called, where everybody in the House of Lords is allowed to table amendments and make speeches and so on. So it was supposed to be scheduled for 3 days. We are now in day 7 of that 3 day stage, which can kind of tell you a bit about where the conversations and filibustering that's been going on. On Wednesday, so that will be the final day of the committee stage in the House of Lords. And what we're expecting is some very significant bits of debate to happen on that day. It will include looking at the financial flow within football and what parameters might potentially be set around such a financial flow. And also whether the independent regulator is actually needed at all, or whether it should have what some Conservatives peers are calling a sunset clause and time limit the regulator. Those are the two big things that are on for debate that are coming up. Once that's concluded, it will go to a report stage in the House of Lords where things will be voted on before it goes to the Commons. But this grand committee stage is probably the most important part of the whole process, because this is where the big issues connected with the bill, big concerns connected with the bill are getting their biggest airing, and those elements of it are being discussed and looking at potential solutions. This is why it's so fundamentally important these next few days, Graham.
Airing is one thing, Niall. You sound frustrated. Are you in any way confident of what you want to happen will actually happen?
On that, I mean, obviously, fair game, we tabled a number of amendments with thanks to some of our really good friends in the Lords. And we've got a mixed response. So some of those, the responses have been, it's already included somewhere in the bill. Other legislation includes it. There are opportunities for potential changes, and there's been one or two straight no's. So there's been some progress. Am I frustrated? I'm frustrated it's taken so long. I'm frustrated that we haven't had uh, overarching support on some of our amendments and some of our ideas. But there's still room for manoeuvre. There's still room for change, and there's still opportunities for things to be improved. And I think Wednesday will be one of those key pivotal moments when we look at football's finances, which is by far and away the most key issue in the whole of the football governance, because that underlines all the other problems. People can talk about ED&I, community engagement, fan engagement, all the rest of it. All of those are almost irrelevant without a fair financial flow, because that's what underpins everything. But ultimately, it's the security of those football clubs, it's the actual existence of those football clubs that is the most important thing. And it's that financial bit that is the key to a good governance going forward.
David, moving away from the minutiae of Westminster and what's likely to happen, you know as well as anyone how the politics of football works at the top. What do you think is likely to be the outcome at this point?
Well, I'm not, as I say, Niall's been closer to the actual recent process than I have. So, in terms of the way this actually might work out, I'm probably going to leave it to him to give a view. But I just want to go back one stage, if I may, because my involvement in this really came through the manifesto group that we put together 4 years ago, which started off this whole process. I want to read you one paragraph from the introduction of our manifesto. It talks about the huge rewards that the Premier League has sort of produced through its great success. It says these rewards have had a massive effect through the football pyramid. Clubs take excessive financial risks to achieve promotion, particularly incurring huge salary commitments. Relegation leaves clubs with parachute payments that temporarily meet unsustainable wages. Competing clubs consequently have to match such wages, creating an inflationary spiral. Struggling clubs attract investment from new owners who often feel forced to gamble to achieve short-term success. The results can be devastating for clubs and their supporters. Stadiums have been sold off for commercial exploitation. Fit and proper person tests are carried out in a weak and inconsistent fashion. The fans, the lifeblood of the game, feel let down and neglected. Clubs can lose their soul. And I think, Graham, the essence of the problem here is that football is not the Premier League. Football is a wonderful, wonderful asset this country has, with a huge base to a pyramid which is actually very shaky at the middle and bottom part of its. It is not secure. It hasn't worked well, and the success of the Premier League has got two sides to the coin. The Premier League on its own, as Martin Samuel quite rightly says, doesn't need a regulator, but football as a whole most certainly does, because
this is Martin. This is Martin Samuel in the Times today.
Yeah, Martin Samuel in the Times today. Sorry, yes, because the Premier League's very success has put stresses on the rest of the game, which have proved insoluble up to now, in spite of many government reports, select committees, and all sorts of investigations. Their conclusion hasn't been reached, and therefore we concluded 4 years ago that only an independent regulator could achieve this. But I'm just going to say, before you ask the next question or ask Niall to comment, that I'm concerned about mission creep with our potential regulator, because you see, I saw this really as a financial regulator. It was not a regulator taking over all the functions of the Football Association. We still have a governing body in the FA who shouldn't be completely. I mean, I'm very disappointed with the FA, but they are still there. They're still a governing body. And as Niall and I certainly agree, I think on totally, it is the financial part of this. It's a distribution of funds. It's the parachute payments, and it's the consequential issues of soft power that the Premier League exerts so cleverly, and it's exerting very cleverly at this moment with members of the House of Lords and maybe members of the press now pushing very hard to try and water this bill down. So that is the essence of the issue as I see it.
Let me pick up on that financial aspect, and I'll play devil's advocate for a moment. If Richard Masters, the Premier League boss, was here, he'd say the game is not on a financial precipice. He'd say over-regulating the game risks damaging the Premier League's appeal around the world. And of course, if that were to happen, well, then every club would suffer. Now, he has a point, doesn't he?
Not at all. There's no intent certainly on our part, I will agree with us, to any way devalue the Premier League. The Premier League, as I say, is one of the country's greatest assets. But what it does need is a larger and different flow of funding to the rest of the game, and other very important consequential issues such as parachute payments. And you see, what other business could you possibly have where a company's income reduces to a quarter or a fifth of what it was before, but you have to maintain the wages levels? It's impossible. And until the situation for relegated clubs and clubs in lower divisions gets sorted out, the pressure and tension on clubs below the Premier League is going to be enormous, and we're going to continue to see failures or something, or very, very unsatisfactory situations.
Just picking up on that, Graham, David's completely right. I mean, we're talking a situation where the fair game analysis is that of the top 92, 58% are technically insolvent, where in the Championship it is routine routine for clubs to be spending more on players' wages than they're getting revenue. Those sort of things in any other sector, in any other industry, would not be tolerated. So those who say that football doesn't need regulation would just need to look at those two facts alone, let alone the fact that we are talking about clubs that are the heartbeat of their communities. There's a whole social and community aspect of football as well. But just on a purely business side, this is a sector that is not working holistically for the whole of the game. David was right to say that the Premier League probably will look at themselves and go, well, we're doing okay. But the Premier League is basically those 20 clubs plus a few others that are on sabbatical in the Championship. Everybody else is struggling. Everybody else is struggling to compete. That element of gambling, that element of trying to spend to compete has got out of control. And it is just seeing dramatic gaps appearing all over the pyramid. And the pressures that are being put on, the cutbacks you're seeing on people starting to not invest in their stadia, starting to not cut back on their backroom staff, ticket prices rising. All of that is a consequence of clubs trying to financially compete with something that is financially unsustainable. And until that distribution is sorted out, we're on a slippery slope. I'm unfortunately on a firm belief that we are looking at the ultimate collapse of a football pyramid. It is a football pyramid almost by name only at the moment. I will constantly and have frequently called it a greasy pole now. The ability to climb up is really, really, really difficult. And if you slide down, then you are sliding down far because you've put yourself at risk to try and reach often unsustainable levels. There are a few exceptions, and Graham, I know that one of those is particularly close to your heart, and I've got a lot of time and respect for Luton, what they tried to do and how they tried to do it. But that is one club that is very much out of kilter with the rest of the football pyramid, and well done to Luton for that.
Very much. That gives us one just about my last quote from our manifesto, but it's absolutely relevant to what Niall has just said. And it's as follows. But the imbalance between the Premier League on the one hand and the rest of English football on the other is now embarrassingly too great. A woefully overstretched football league and a clearly underfunded FA are simply unable to meet their commitments to their constituencies and the wider game. Multi-million television deals for some are lauded at the same time as facilities, including pitches for the grassroots, wither away. This cannot be desirable. We believe real structural reform, however it is achieved, will still enable the EPL to continue much as it does currently, and with its independence intact, with the benefits to the rest of the game would be enormous. And I can't put it more succinctly than that. And it ties exactly with the view that Niall is expressing.
Mm. The imbalance is all because the Premier League has all the money. As I understand it, they've spent nearly £50 million in legal costs a couple of years, well, ongoing really, upholding its rules, defending the Super League channel. So is there a case to say, well, whatever happens, it's another lawyer's paradise and they'll simply take it to the courts and try and argue it out there? Niall?
Well, I mean, we said at the beginning that this can only work if the regulator is backed by statutory powers, has the power of Parliament behind, but is independent and vitally important, free of vested interests. Because the other problem that football constantly has are vested interests. So this goes right back to the foundation of the Premier League, because a lot of people at the time were wearing more than one hat as members of the FA and were involved with football clubs and so on. And the world would have been very different had there been true independence around then. And that hasn't really changed. And even some of the people, as I say, speaking on behalf within Parliament are not actually independent. They're representing clubs and organisations. So vested interests bedevil football, and the independent regulator needs to be able to rise above that, but with the power and the support of Parliament, whilst remaining independent. And I just want to say, I'm concerned if the regulator becomes in effect, massive civil service department, because that's not the way this was intended originally. I believe it needs to be strong, fast-footed, and as unbureaucratic as possible in a complex world.
I
As a
agree with David 100% there. I mean, I think that issue about vested interest is very, very important because the soft power that David talks about from the Premier League and so many other organisations, the potential of the non-executive directors or the chair even of the independent regulator or the independent panel of experts all taking their money largely because of Premier League or other subsidies really brings into question that element of vested interest and conflict of interest that needs to be addressed. Because when we talk about a regulator, the thing we talk about first with that, the suffix, the prefix we give to it every time is independent. And that's the key. It needs to be independent because if we want an holistic solution for football, it can't be at the beck and call of one particular funder over another. And that's one of my, I think, Fair Game's big concerns because there is an opportunity here to holistically solve some of the big fundamental issues in football, but it needs to be on a holistic, independent level.
David, as a former club chairman, how do you persuade your board of directors at your Premier League club that they need to spend more money on teams outside the Premier League? Without
probably with difficulty.
Exactly.
which is why you need a regulator. I mean, look, if I was still chairman of Manchester City, I probably wouldn't be able to have this conversation with you in the same way. I'd be committed to my club. I had to put as a director of the club or chairman of the club, I had to put the club's interest first. That's the way it is really with any corporate situation. You have fiduciary duties to your shareholders and other people involved. So that's the whole point, really. The Premier League has not willingly come to the table, and I can understand up to a point why, which is why they have to be brought to the table, and why the regulator has to be sitting at the table when these financial matters are discussed. And one of the problems about the bill, which I don't think has changed as yet, and nor do I think it probably will, is that the regulator potentially is a long stop, not the wicketkeeper. He's on the, I would put it differently, he's on the bench, not on the pitch, where the regulator needs to be. And that is, I think, is absolutely crucial. Because if this sort of carries on leading to the unequal negotiations between the all-powerful Premier League and the rest of football, it won't end well.
That's a really fundamental point David makes. On Wednesday, this is one of the things that will be up for debate in the House of Lords, because that will be the moment where we discuss the idea of a regulator potentially setting the parameters about what a financial distribution deal must meet. If the regulator is properly independent, is looking holistically at football and is saying, and it has a remit to address the financial sustainability of the game, then those parameters you would expect would include things about closing the gap between the divisions, because that is one of the big problems that is causing the strain and stresses within the whole of the football pyramid, and other parameters that might also come into play. But those things, that is the power that the regulator needs to be. That's what turns the regulator from David Bernstein's kind of connection here, from being right in the middle of the action on the pitch or the left back in the changing room. That's the bit that we need to be. That's where you need to have the regulator right there in the middle, because otherwise we're just watching the same thing unfold time and time again with the same power dynamics as we've always had. And that's why I think it's so absolutely fundamentally important that the regulator's right in the middle of the action. And that's what makes Wednesday so important.
But this is where I suspect the Premier League will be working very hard to try and avoid this actually happening in this way. It is not in their interest.
How do you answer the argument, though, that the independent regulator, hopefully outside any civil service type of working, would introduce the regulation alongside more bureaucracy? And again, from a board's point of view, that would prevent future investment from would-be owners and so on. It would just put people off investing money at the top. And once again, we have the problem of no money coming through.
Well, this is why I think it is so very important that the regulator is independent, not part of government, not part of the civil service, fast moving, not too bureaucratic, a little different from the way much of this country is run. Because there's a lot right with football. I mean, but the beautiful thing about football, this is why VAR is so controversial, is its immediacy. It's a fast-moving game. It is what it is, and the public absolutely love it. But hence, it's so important that small clubs are protected, and and have looked after to some extent. Hopefully, this will be done. But there's an area I think one area that Niall and I may agree on a little less, because we agree on virtually everything on this, particularly on the financial part, and that is some of the mission, what I call mission creep. You see, I've read, Niall will have heard it, the desire from some members of the House of Lords and MPs for the regulator to get involved in all sorts of what I would call peripheral issues in football terms, not in national terms. So net zero, the environment, even diversity, which I certainly don't downplay for one moment, but I'm not sure that they're the regulator's mandate. I think the Football Association, and when I was chairman of the Football Association, I was asked by the Prime Minister to produce a report on behalf of the whole of football dealing with diversity and discrimination, and we did a very successful job, produce a report signed off by the whole of football. I think that a lot of that stuff should remain with the Football Association to enable the regulator to perhaps to be more focused and less broad-based, expected to deal with virtually everything vaguely connected with football. I like to see this as a focused, sort of targeted exercise to try and deal with some of the issues that you also.
Niall? The revenue distribution, though, it could mean money moving from one billionaire to another, because there are 14 billionaires, I gather, in ownership positions in the championship already. I mean, how happy are you with that, Niall? I mean, this distribution.
I think it goes beyond the championship as well. I think that's one of the big things to realise. There's so much beyond that, and we're not talking about the idea of going from one billionaire to another. What we're talking about ultimately is thinking about a football club, its history, its traditions, and beyond the lifetime of one particular owner. We're talking about securing those clubs and their future for the long haul. And I think that's the bit that we need to start looking about, not thinking about who is the current owner or the current particular custodian of that club. It's about making sure that club's there. And that's why a fairer financial distribution is really important. And that's why you need to look at making sure that those clubs that are well run, that are encouraged to be more financially sustainable, that's the way football needs to go. It's one of the things that I remember very early on in Fair Game's lifetime, that we were talking to the DCMS, and the DCMS said, if you want change to happen tomorrow, incentivize it. So if you start telling to clubs, you will get more money for being well run, then that will start seeing those CFOs, the CEOs of clubs starting to go, well, actually, this is the way we need to restructure our model, because that's what will be rewarded. That's one of the key elements that I think Fair Game would push for. But number one is still about the amount of money being at the top end of the game. When you're talking the £3.2 billion that currently goes through for the broadcast deal, 88% of that remains in the Premier League. Half of the remaining 12% goes to clubs who receive parachute payments. So that means you've got 6% going to the rest of the football pyramid, which by and large obviously does not cover that, does not make that a fair football pyramid. And you can imagine what that looks like in terms of a triangle. I mean, it's just, just not a triangle.
But the cost of regulation will come from the Premier League clubs. Now, what will they do? Will they perhaps cut down on academies or women's football, or of course pass the costs on to the fans? Again, we've got this problem of how they're actually going to pay for it.
I don't think you have to feel too concerned about Premier League finances. They've got more than enough income between the 20 clubs to deal with this. It's not an issue. They won't be cutting back on. And if there was a little bit of pressure, downward pressure on footballers' wages, it would not be a bad thing, frankly. But I don't think one needs to be too concerned about Premier League financing. That's not the issue here.
And the regulator won't have any say in wages, will he or she?
Well, this is what's interesting.
But there was one area. It's a little bit detailed, but one area which I think without which we'll never get this really sorted, and that is, I think the regulator should be looking at parachute payments or doing away with parachute payments, but only if there is mandatory salary reductions if a club gets relegated. So because you cannot pay Premier League salaries outside the Premier League. It's as simple as that. So I referred to that earlier. I think that's an absolute must. Otherwise, I don't think whatever you do, this could ever get sorted. Because parachute payments themselves are highly uncompetitive. That means the clubs that go down with parachute payments have a much higher chance of coming back up, and that's actually what happens. And the beauty of the English game, I believe, is the power and the strength of the great clubs, and the Arsenals and Man Cities and so on. But it's also the dream. It's the possibility that a club can rise from the lower depths, into the Championship and maybe the Premier League, and can do. And I must say, to see clubs like Brentford and Brighton back to trend, I think it's absolutely wonderful. So it's amazing. They've done a great job because they are extremely professionally run.
I'd agree with that. I think there is a whole element about looking at that whole financial flow. I think that's just so fundamental to look at how you do that and how you address it. Now, when it comes to a TV distribution deal, one of the things that happened that was quite important was that the Premier League did put presentations to the EFL, and in their presentation, in their 32-page PowerPoint, one of the things that was discussed and was hinted at was player wages. So, you will have this amount of money if you do this. It's like instructing what the EFL must do if they are to get this amount of money. So there is, within the proposals that the clubs put forward, the leagues put forward, that scope for talking about wage restraint. So there is stuff in there. So where I think you've got the potential is when we talk about the parameters that a regulator sets. While I would say they wouldn't necessarily need to be totally prescriptive, they could say you need to look at wage inflation. Tell us how you're going to tackle wage inflation as part of your distribution deal. That is something that actually is already happening with all the other proposals that are put forward by the Premier League. What we're asking for here is that regulator has that ability to look at some of that financial distribution and how that works and what those parameters need to be put in place. Because I think David's got a very good point when he talks about wages in the Premier League compared to wages in the Championship and the parachute payments. And then, from my view, also the wages lower down the pyramid and all those clubs that are spending more on wages than they get on revenue. All of those things are really significant and are things that could be, without changing any kind of way the processes and negotiations happen at the moment, be part of those parameters for which any proposal needs to meet.
I propose that, Graham. A little while, 6 months ago, I got some figures from the Football League, from the chairman of the Football League. I asked the question: what is the average, roughly the average income of a lower half Premier League club? And it's about 200 million or so. Their wages are about 80% on average. That's 160 million, right? So a club in the bottom half of the Premier League has a wages bill, let's call it about 160 million, give or take. The average Football League income for the same club, if it got relegated, with parachute payments, is about 80 to 90 million, I believe. And without parachute payments, I think it's as low as 30 million. So you'd have a scenario, if there's no control, that a club's income goes down from 200 million to 30 to 80 million with a wage bill of 160 million. Now, those figures have been ENOE, but they give an indication of the impossible scenario that clubs that get relegated don't get re-promoted face. Would you agree roughly with that? No?
I've seen very similar stats on that, and it is phenomenal that you're talking the average of 270 million versus the average of 30 million. 2007, that gap was around a quarter of that. So the gap has grown massively in 19 years, in 17 years.
Oh, hugely, hugely.
So it's become unsustainable. It's become, and that's every year it's getting wider and wider, which makes the pressure on the rest of the pyramid just huge.
What about from the governing body's point of view? UEFA are saying a regulator's power could undermine the autonomy of the game. Do they have a point?
We covered this in our manifesto, and we compared the situation in this country with France and Germany and Italy, all of which have had various forms of intervention in different ways, but various forms of intervention by their governments and so on to try and deal with some of these issues. I mean, none are dealt with perfectly, and on all occasions the UEFA and FIFA have in the end got along with it. Nobody's going to throw this country out of the World Cup, or Italy, or Germany. It's just not going to happen. But this is a threat that, of course, the Premier League love to bring up. This is the first line of defence, or the last line of defence, that the Premier League love to bring up. Oh, you'll offend UEFA or FIFA, and you'll be out of all these competitions. It will not happen. And in any case, this is an independent regulator, and is not and should not be government running football.
Is that the message you get, Niall, when you hear that point of view put forward as a defence?
You know, what's very interesting is today I was speaking to a couple of MPs, and I was having a very similar conversation, and they talked very robustly saying this is an arm's length regulator. This is a regulator that will be independent, and for that reason there will be no political intervention, and that completely rebukes any idea about it being UEFA or FIFA having any concern, because that is exactly where it's not going to be. There was only ever one concern previously, and that was about the previous iteration of this bill that included a line about must bear attention to the current foreign policy and trade policies of the government of the day. That's been removed, and that was considered to be okay by the people who were evaluating it at the time. But that was the one question mark you could possibly have raised. That's gone. So this is now, in my mind, and I've had that real strong reassurance just today, this is going to be arm's length. It's going to be independent. It's going to be free from political intervention. And that, for me, kills stone dead the UEFA or FIFA argument, let alone the actual reality that even if it was seen to be slightly meddling, the likelihood of FIFA or UEFA kicking England out of a tournament is basically close to zero. I don't see this being a problem. And it is literally a bit of saber rattling by the Premier League and their friends in the House of Lords, trying to stir up something that isn't even an issue.
The ownership test makes a lot of sense. I think all sides agree to that. But could it be seen as subjective in terms of perhaps it might deter would-be investors, or even worse, create those long-lasting and expensive litigation cases that we're already seeing in other areas? In particular, I'm thinking Manchester City once again, David. But I mean, is that a problem?
Well, it is a very, very nutty, really, really difficult problem, really difficult, with nation states owning clubs and so on and so forth. I think all one can say really is it exists at the moment. There are owners' tests at the moment. I think the concern, you see, look, leaving aside the financial aspects of the Premier League is not some independent organisation. The Premier League is the 20 clubs. It's the 20 clubs who run the Premier League, really and truly. And Masters or anybody else, or even Richard Scudamore, who I have great respect for. But they were servants of the clubs, and they have to deliver on behalf of the club. So the issue really isn't the difficulty surrounding owners' tests, because it's independence of thinking and the consistency of thinking behind that. Because as things stand, you could easily have a scenario where a club, a largish club that has not got a sort of nation state type support, or a multi-billionaire support, then it's got a sort of moderate support, financial support, gets the opportunity of something much bigger, and the other clubs don't like it. The other clubs much rather not have another competitor. I mean, it could have happened with Newcastle and Saudi Arabia coming in. The regulator should be able to produce at least a consistent, independent view on the thing. I'm not saying it's simple, but it'll be a lot better because of the independence aspect of it than what we have at the moment.
Niall, so go on.
I was going to pick up on that. One of the big things we have with the owners and directors test, and there are 3 different owners and directors tests at the moment, is the transparency and the openness about what's actually being asked, what we're actually holding these potential owners to account, and what the process is. There are a whole load of elements about what questions you should be asked and so on. And we can go in and talk about that for weeks on end. But knowing what those questions are, knowing what that process is actually one of the bigger gaps that we have at the moment. Because you can't say, right, well, why would this person not been taken forward? And also, what confidence do fans and clubs have if we don't actually know what allows you to be a good owner or a good director or a good, because we don't know what that process is. We don't know what those questions were, and we don't know how they were held to account. There is a guide, but it's not telling you exactly what that process looked like. And I think what's good about this potential new owners and directors test is not only could it potentially spell out exactly what it is, and I'd like to see a lot of transparency, but they actually, for the first time, will be able to call on to existing government bodies that have access to all of this straight away. So people going, will this owners and directors test be more burdensome? Well, answer, probably not, because you will have access to all the kind of criminal databases, the registration of things that are happening overseas. All of that becomes instantly accessible and part of that process. So you will have a more accountable owners and directors test. Let's make it more transparent. Let's make sure we know what those questions are. And I think we could be in a much clearer and well-defined place than we are at the moment. Because it just feels a bit too opaque at the moment, and that's a problem. And we've seen numerous times where bad owners have gone through and have caused problems later down the line. That's where we need to be getting that a little bit more robust. I mean, I suspect David probably has got tales to tell from all this from his day, whether he's allowed to or not, I don't know. But certainly there will be more stuff from David than what I know of. I know of some from some of the clubs that I've spoken to in their past and their history, but the fact that there are too many tales to tell is a problem in itself.
Well, I mean, in the case of my own club at Manchester City, not long after I left the club as chair, they were taken over by the Thai Thaksin Shinawatra. Now, with hindsight, anybody looking at his record, I think was seriously doubted whether he was fit or whether he was proper. Say no more than that. But how something like that got through the system, I have no idea. I fought against it at the time, unsuccessfully. But there you are. But anyway, the independent regulator I think can only be an improvement on where we are now because of the above all of the independence.
Niall, you've sat through a lot of this debate, and even if it all comes to fruition, what's stopping the Premier League from saying, no, we're not interested, we don't agree with it, we're an independent body, we'll carry on, and we'll have no relegation, no promotion, we'll just carry on as the Premier League. We're making all this money, who's going to stop us?
It's a really interesting point. But my point of view on this is when you looked at the fan reaction to the European Super League, which, to be honest, surprised me to the extent of how vocal and robust it was. I think there's an element there that says that's why it can't happen, because this is still the nation's game. So there is still, it's beyond. Football isn't just the Premier League. And I think that's what makes football in this country so special. That's the key element to it. That dream element that David mentioned about the idea of a smaller club potentially getting up. That's what makes football in this country so unique and so special. Yes, the Premier League might want to put up all its, put up all its bridges and say, right, no. I don't think that would happen with the Premier League. There's a small part of me that fears a World Super League with maybe two or three of the very top clubs potentially splitting away and saying, well, we'll just operate in a way outside of European systems or whatever, become like the Harlem Globetrotters of football. That worries me. But I don't think the majority of the Premier League clubs, a vast majority of the Premier League clubs, would want football to move in that direction. How that's protected, there's a licensing system with every football club. So you would lose your license if you start to play in an unauthorized football league, a football division. And that those licenses also need to be approved. So there's a whole element that comes into it. Clubs individually pulling out and starting up something completely new that sits outside that framework, that's still a ghost sitting on the shoulders of people. That's still haunting. And I still think there's a fear that potentially happened. I think the European Super League is still a possibility. I think a World Super League is potentially a possibility where you have clubs like, I'd hate to say it, David Bernstein, the idea of City Blues playing a couple of games in Manchester and a couple of games in Chicago and a few other games in Beijing throughout the year with elite players, but not paying any attention to the English football pyramid. That worries me. I can see the potential of that. I don't want that to happen, but if you want me to play like a doomsday scenario of football, that would be where I'd lead it to.
David, we've got foreign owners here. Do they really care about the English fans? They care about their investment. They care about their future finances and so on. I mean, why would they take any notice of the fans?
Well, I think that's a bit of generalisation. I think some care more than others, some care less than others. I think you can see some clubs lose overseas ownership very badly run indeed. There was one major club in particular who I won't mention, but also some clubs with overseas ownership very well run, including my own Manchester City. I think who have been an extremely well run club and who've done a huge amount for their community as well. But then we come back to the need for a statutory-backed independent regulator, because if this works, then these people will have to care. The regulator must have those powers. The regulator hasn't got the powers. They've got no chance in hell of fighting these very, very powerful bodies. I mean, you may have Elon Musk buying Liverpool before very long. Who knows? I mean, these are some of the world's most powerful people. So you've got no chance at all unless it is structurally sound and the regulator comes with a heavy stick.
We're coming to the end of our time on this particular podcast. Sum up for us, David. What's the best case scenario and the worst case scenario as we hear and see what's happening through this particularly important week?
Well, I think the best case scenario for me, which I think I'm being a little optimistic if it's going to happen, is that first of all the regulator is appointed, which I think will happen. That the responsibilities of the regulator are not overboard, that they are focused enough that the regulator can possibly deliver and thus become a sort of huge bureaucracy, and that the financial part of this that we focused on in the first part of this podcast is really front of mind, and that the regulator's powers to try and achieve the things that we want on finance really come through, because without that, I think the West is going to fall away. Then it will be a much ado about nothing. Well, my worst case is the opposite of that, is that you have a regulator with a sort of a big setup, lots of 50, 70 people involved, producing a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of stuff involved in social issues as much as football issues, and the whole thing becomes a mess. And then I believe that Martin's summary of the Times might be correct if that's how it turns out. So there's a lot to play for here. Am I optimistic? I'm not that. I'm not that optimistic. I think as things stand, I think this is not quite where I thought this would be when we started off.
Niall, you've invested so much time into this. David's not overly optimistic. How do you see it? What's good and what's bad?
Probably slightly more optimistic than David. Not a great deal, but I'm slightly more optimistic. Um, I think where we are on is a moment where those who care about the game need to step forward and realise that this is literally one or two clauses within this bill could dramatically change football for the better. And they are the clauses connected around financial distribution. And they are the clauses that turn that backstop to a wicketkeeper. That's the difference, what it makes. Let's have that regulator right in the centre of the action. I'm not interested in the kind of having a cinema view. And they need to be the lead actor. They need to be the person who's saying, right, well, financially, what's good for the game? Financially, holistically, what's going to help the game move forward for the whole of the football pyramid? That is on the table. That is a potential right now, as we speak, that could happen. I would hope, at a bare minimum, that the regulator gets that opportunity to set those parameters about what is acceptable. That for me would be a significant step forward in helping solve football. So, do I think there's a possibility of success? Yes, I do. Am I optimistic? Well, I'm more optimistic than Dave. It doesn't make me optimistic. Um, and uh, where do I see the fear? Where could it go wrong? Well, it's that Manchester City becoming that Harlem Globetrotters, losing two or three clubs to the global Super League, the Premier League pulling up, which they almost have right now, pulling up that relegation, ending it relegation, just saying, right, well, we'll just go off and do our own thing. Um, that's my fear, and cutting off the fundings and seeing all the clubs that are already struggling even more than they are, and people remembering that when a club goes into administration, those are communities that lose all their local businesses. Those are people that really suffer. That's real people suffering caused by a financial imbalance in the football pyramid.
And also now the other thing is the whole thing is so arbitrary in a way. The Premier League and the 20 clubs have to be the 20 clubs at a particular moment in time. But yeah, think of the great clubs, the big club, the Leeds United, Sunderland, Sheffield Wednesday, great clubs of all who happen not to be in the Premier League at the wrong moment, and could be cast asunder forever if your fears were realised.
That's exactly it. So, all those clubs, those fans of those clubs are the ones that should be particularly where everybody should be. But they're the ones who, quite, that's your dream will never be realised.
I mean, we've seen this weekend in the FA Cup how the minnows have been denied life-saving amounts of money with a replay because the FA and indeed the Premier League clubs said we don't want replays. We don't want replays.
Exactly, absolutely.
That key element of survival and income has been cast aside by the powers that be, who appear not to care about the smaller clubs. That seems to me to be the fear. They've done it once. They might well do it again on a larger, grander scale.
Well, you make a very good point about the FA Cup. I mean, I think it's it's shameful over the years how the FA Cup has been devalued because of the success of the Premier League and European football. And the FA is interesting. You see, the FA has never been strong enough to really fight its corner sufficiently well. It's outmaneuvered. It's out. With the weight of Premier League money, the FA just can't compete, can't cope. And that's one of the problems we've got here. I mean, had things been different, the FA would be much, much stronger. And by the way, this will never happen. But one of our recommendations was that these monies going to the rest of football shouldn't be distributed directly by the Premier League because they come with conditions of soft power and so on. They should go through an independent body, or maybe the FA, who they should distribute. But anyway, that's an aside because that will never happen. But the weakness of the Football Association is behind a great deal of this, and that happened over many, many, many years, where the FA has been much too slow to modernise and change.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, on your idea of an independent body doing the distribution, David, that's one that fair game back as well. So totally agree on that. And then look, behind me on my wall is a signed shirt from the 1988 FA Cup final. So that's how much it means to me.
Which club is that? Which club is that? Wimbledon.
Wimbledon, David.
Yeah, Wimbledon. Right.
Yeah, that's a sign.
That was a great day for football when a little club like Wimbledon managed to do that. People are talking about that today. That's what football. That what football's really should be about. About the great games with Arsenal playing Man United and so on, but also a competitive lower divisions where they can do these things and where the great success of Wimbledon all those years ago is still remembered. That's the beauty of the game.
Exactly, David. That's where it comes to, Graham, on your point, Tamworth, if they'd have got a replay, that's a million extra quid for a club like Tamworth. That's what the magic of the FA Cup should be. I'd love it to be back to the old days where you woke up at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning and your TV was all saturation about the FA Cup finals building up to the final event. That's me with my little rose tinted eyes, thinking about those days which was amazing. And that was the power and the magic of the FA Cup and the magic of football. That's the sort of thing that people we could hark back to and remember with happy days.
Let's see if we can hold on to some magic as this week progresses. David Bernstein, former FA and Manchester City chairman, and Niall Couper, the man behind Fair Game, thank you so much for your time today and steering us through these potentially extremely important developments for football. And we wait with bated breath to see what happens. Thank you for listening to We Love You Football. Of course, the podcast's available on all major platforms. The producer and editor is Ian Beach. I'm Graham Miller. And until the next time, it's goodbye for now.